Welcome to Just Break Up, the podcast about love, heartbreak, and all the relationship advice you don't want to hear. My name is Sierra DeMulder.
And I'm Sam Blackwell. And today we're going to answer a letter from somebody who's feeling scared to disclose that she has herpes. But before we begin, we just want to give you our Surgeon General's warning, which is that Sierra and I are not licensed mental health practitioners.
No, we are definitely not. We are not professionals. We are not trained in any of this. Everything we've learned is either from a therapist, our lived experience, or the internet. So please take our advice as you see fit. Right? Please take our advice as you see fit. We're only here to offer our humble musings to hopefully shed some understanding and maybe some laughs about the incredibly rewarding but mostly confusing experience that is love. All right, before we dive into today's letter, it's the first episode of the week, so we're going to do a quick check-in topic. And today, the check-in topic is inspired by something I found on the internet. I was scouring relationship advice memes on the internet, like getting prepared to do like a meme review that we haven't done in a while. But instead, I actually found like a pretty cool piece of information that we can apply to our dating lives. This is from an account called Liz Listens. She's a licensed therapist who gives out relationship advice. Her content is very well followed. I liked what I saw on my brief perusing of it. But the specific post I found was on this idea called finding the bad guy. Finding the bad guy is something we do in conflict. And it's the thing that we do that, like, when somebody brings a conflict to us, we immediately try to find the bad guy in the other person. It's a defense mechanism. And it's this thing that we do in which we point fingers to escalate this pattern of mutual blame. And it's a true escalation because the conflict then never ends. It's never resolved. Yep. And it's like the exact opposite of team building. You know, it pits you against this other person.
For sure.
The Liz Listens account had this great example that I'll share before we dive into this concept and give our thoughts. The example would be like one partner says, "Why did you leave the car window open all night? The inside of the car is soaked." And then the other person goes, "Well, maybe if you'd help me get the kids out of the car, I wouldn't have forgotten." And then the partner one says, "So what? You can't get the kids out of the car and remember to close the windows? You were on your phone texting all the time. That's why you were distracted." And then the second partner says, "I was texting because you made us miss the doctor's appointment and I had to let them know we were rescheduling." You know, it's this finding the bad guy is constantly, you know, taking someone's conflict, turning it back on them and finding something that you can connect to them. And I really, really resonated with that because of my own, I think, defensiveness, which is ultimately like a fear of conflict, a fear of being disappointed in someone, you know. Mm-hmm. I think for me, I really relate to this because like at my most unhealed, if somebody brings a conflict to me or like maybe they bring something to me that I've done that they don't like, if I deflect it, then maybe it gets me out of the crosshairs or so to speak. Like,
yep.
It's safer to win in an argument than it is to lose in my mind. And that's both like malicious to my partner and it's not good for me because because it's ultimately, even though it seems like a controlling thing to do, it's ultimately about fear that like I'm unlovable if I make a mistake. So it's totally unsustainable.
For sure.
Yeah. So this is all to say, I definitely relate to this idea of finding the bad guy, and I've gotten a lot better at it, but I know that, like, you know, when my wife and I are worn down, we're tired because of the toddler and we've got things going on, we definitely fall back on this pattern instead of, you know, the post gives another example of instead of starting that forever back and forth, that loop of mutual blame, you can close that loop by being a teammate and being like, "Oh, hey, you left the windows open," or "Why did you leave the windows open?" The partner too can say something like, "Oh man, I'm sorry I did do that. I can't believe that I do that. You know, I can't believe I did that. I've been so distracted." Or, "Oh man, I'm sorry I did that." And then the partner one can receive that accountability and say something like, "Oh, it's okay. It happens. I I know you've had a lot on your mind, or we can clean it up together, or whatever, it requires this mutual self-awareness that I know it's hard to access when we're like tired and stressed.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And especially if we feel like we're like under attack, where it's like, I got to put my defenses up immediately. And for all of the reasons that you talked about, like, I need to deflect. I need to, like, if I admit any sort of fault or blame, then like I'm like a bad person, or like people will like take advantage of me or whatever it might be because of all the things that we've learned. And like, I see this all the time in like work relationships in my consulting business outside of this Just Break Up podcast, where like, it's the same thing where people are just going back and forth and like doing whatever they can to deflect blame. And I think that that's like part of like the culture of workplaces is like we prey on people who make mistakes, like this idea of perfectionism. But it's like, it doesn't actually help anything to do this blame game because like you said, like no one wins. And also the problem doesn't get solved, right? Like if no one is to blame for anything, then no one has to take any accountability for, but changing their behavior or doing something different. Right. So, I mean, this is like a specific example that you had of like the car window being open. Right. But often I think it happens in like how we talk to each other, how we interact with each other. So when somebody's like, hey, the way that you said that to me, like really impacted me negatively. It's like, well, you said this thing last time that really impacted me negatively. Or like, oh, you're just so sensitive like back and forth. And it's like, it can be so hard for us to sit and hear and accept the idea of like, oh shit, I made a mistake, right? Or like, oh shit, I said something that caused somebody harm or hurt them or whatever it might be, right? Like, and part of it is like accepting the reality of we are all of us capable of making mistakes, of leaving the car window open. We are also all of us capable of causing harm to people intentionally or unintentionally, right? Like we are all able to do that. It is like, it is built into what it means to be human. And instead of, going immediately to that place of like, oh, if I do that, I'm a horrible person. Or if I've made that mistake, then somehow I'm unworthy of love or whatever. So much of the work of being able to like prevent that sort of spiral into blame is not about like actually forgiving your partner. It's also about like forgiving yourself. Like obviously forgiveness of your partner is like part of it, but like so much of it is like when I have moments like that where like Peter does something and I'm just like, fuck this. Like, how could he do this? I have to stop and be like, I make mistakes too, right? Like I am not perfect. And this desire for perfection from me and other people is like harmful to me and other people. So like, how can I hold that I make mistakes, that Peter makes mistakes, that everyone makes mistakes, and that's something I'm going to have to live with for my entire life if I want to be in relationship with people, right? Is other people
totally
making mistakes.
Right when you were making that point, I was writing in my notes, it's also connected to our ability to self-soothe and receive their accountability. Like, for me, it's not just being aware of how we're responding to someone's criticism. It's how are we receiving their accountability, right? Like, so say you're the person bringing the note about the window, hey, you left the window open last night. If they say, oh my God, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Or, oh, dang, I didn't mean to do that. What more do you need in that moment? Are you ready to receive their accountability? Are you approaching this? Liz Listens, the account I pulled this from, says it's shifting your mindset from a win-lose mindset around conflict to a win-win. So the win has to be, I'm going to let you know that the window is open, and you're going to let me know that the window was open. Like what you
That's
maybe
real.
an apology, right? And then so often like the window's like a little like a no consequence one, but maybe it's something about like how my partner said something to me, and so I go to them with this hurt, and they apologize. Then at some point I have to be like, okay, they apologized. It's this thing. the whole thing reminds me of like fight or flight, truly, because it's almost as our like our brains, when they bring conflict to us, our brains are like, I gotta go. I gotta find something stronger. I have to find something bigger. I have to distract from that conflict with this bigger conflict. It's connected to the idea that, you know, two things can be true at the same time. Like Sam said, your partner can make a mistake, and also you can make a mistake at the same time, but they're not connected. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Sometimes I think my brain, my defense mechanisms are like, oh, you know, say my wife comes to me and says, I didn't, you know, appreciate the way you said this. And then all of a sudden I'm like, well, you once said something in this way. You know what I mean?
I do.
But
yes.
but they're separate. Two things can be true at the same time. Not that, you know, it's like my wife can come to me and say, I was hurt with the way you said that. And separately, I could be hurt by the way she'd said something at a different time, in a different conversation, in a different argument. I don't have to thread them together in order to make me more lovable or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, I thought this was super helpful, at least for me. I'm a very like visual person. So I love the metaphor of looking for a bad guy to blame, you know, like it's looking for it in this conversation instead of saying there's not a bad guy here, because it's a win-win engagement. It's a win-win partnership. And we're approaching this conflict not like there's going to be a protagonist and an antagonist, or a winner and a loser, but we're approaching it like we're both winners. You know, we're in this to not solve a problem, but to reach a mutual agreement instead of mutual blame.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I think that makes a ton of sense.
Cool. Yeah, I will be thinking about that for a while. Ready to dive into today's letter?
Yeah, let's do it. All right, so today's letter comes from pretty much a trash bag whose pronouns are she, her, who is writing from the abyss of regret. Okay, so I have a problem, and it's a pretty ethically messed up one, so heads up. To paint the picture, I'm an early to mid-20s bisexual woman, she, her, and about a year ago, I met a man that I am head over heels for. We met on a dating app for short-term fun before we were both heading out on some long travels. We ended up having some pretty immediate sparks that felt like magic, and I haven't really felt this excited / borderline obsessed, LOL, about somebody since damn near high school. We ended up staying in touch over the last year and have found time to see each other in between each of our traveling jobs. I'm realizing that even though we don't know each other super well, only through our first sporadic interactions, that he is someone I want to pursue intentionally and romantically. However, there's a very serious piece of information that I haven't shared with him and that I feel like I should have from the get-go. About a year before meeting him, I contracted HSV-1, herpes for layman's terms. It was an earth-shattering experience, not just because it's a lifelong disease with tons of false societal stigmas, but because I am someone that took protection very seriously. And the literal first time in my life that I didn't use protection was someone when I first hooked up with them, I got an STD. I'm a very sex-positive person and don't want to paint a haughtiness vibe with all of my protection standards because I know that everyone's story is different and we're all human. And still, I feel some serious spite towards the world and people in my life that I know who have not practiced safe sex and yet not contracted anything. The whole classic why me situation. I think I've moved past that mentally and am more into acceptance now, but wasn't there when I first met this guy. The first day we hooked up, he had made a joke about herpes. The joke was in the context of us sharing our gross feet stories due to the nature of our shared hobbies and him saying, maybe it's foot herpes, which completely sets the tone of immature, insensitive douchebag bro. And maybe he is one and I just don't know it yet. However, throughout the conversations we've had since that first date, I've come to know a very compassionate, curious, and sensitive person. I know that I didn't tell him that first day mainly due to that joke and due to me not having slept with a man since getting herpes and having a larger fear around a cis man's response than anyone else's. This type of confusion around this feels really strange and foreign because before this, I'd operated with a total fuck it, I know my truth and my worth mindset around men. Don't get me wrong, I'm riddled with insecurities outside of this situation, but I've never struggled with sharing pieces of myself as much as I have with this. So my predicament, outside of feeling incredibly guilty and detached from the moral code I had lived by, aka honesty and transparency, is that I want to share this information with him, firstly, because it's the right thing to do, and secondly, because I know I must in order for there to be any real possibility of a healthy relationship. And I am terrified of rejection, terrified of the overwhelming guilt I feel and will feel in that conversation, and terrified that I have waited too long for there to be any possibility of trust. I know that he is entitled to not want to continue to see me because of this, and I want to be prepared to respect that boundary. Basically, I fucked up big time, and I'm scared of the consequences for owning that. We have plans to see each other soon, and I want to have this conversation when we do. What I'm really asking for from you all, other than listening to my lengthy venting of fear, is for some advice on how to navigate this conversation in an empathetic and still self-respecting, but not dissolving into excuses way. Thank you so much for the safety you provide in us sharing some of our biggest fuck-ups. Sincerely, with love and gratitude, pretty much a trash bag.
All right, Pretty. That's what I'm going to call you. Thank you so much for writing and for trusting us with this letter. I feel really honored to hold this space with you. And I love what you highlighted in that last paragraph about, just break up being a place that we can share our mistakes and, navigate or plan out paths to navigate beyond them. And that's hopefully what Sam and I are going to provide for you. This all makes a lot of sense to me. Even our worst mistakes or even things that we regret or aren't in alignment with our morals. It's so helpful to see why we would do X, Y, and Z, because then we're more deeply connected with with what got us here and what we can use to get us out of here. Right.
Yep.
So we're going to talk about how you can navigate this conversation, how to carry maybe the regret that you have about not disclosing this earlier, how to forgive yourself for that. But first, we have to take a very quick break.
All right, everyone, welcome back. Thanks again, Pretty, for writing to us and for trusting us with this question. And I think that Tia and I have talked about this on the podcast a lot, but I think it's been a while since we talked about STDs and STD stigma and the ways in which people talk and feel about STDs. So I thought it would be good for us to just kind of do our little soapbox moment about
I think it's good.
STDs and all of the fucked up ways in which we think about and talk about people with STDs and treat them. STDs are a really normal part of life, right? Like STDs, like any illness, are things that we can catch for lots of different reasons in lots of different contexts. Part of our weird purity culture around sex has had us decide that STDs are somehow worse than other types of illness, right? That they are,
and are a source of punishment.
Yeah, absolutely. That they are somehow grosser than other types of illness and deserve more shame than other types of illness. And the idea of, using protection and being sort of cognizant of how we are transmitting diseases, right? That really helpful sort of public health message around how we can support the idea of not spreading diseases that don't need to be spread has turned into this, either if you have an STD, it's your fault because you didn't use protection, right? And what we know to be true is that that's not true, that lots of STDs are transmitted even if you use protection, and that not everyone wants to or needs to use protection all the time, and that STDs can be spread, right? And I want to also name that we have a particular sort of stigma attached to STDs that are long-term, right? So herpes as an STD that you kind of live with for the rest of your life. Same thing with HIV, right? All of these sort of illnesses that then we carry with us have an extra special stigma attached to them, which is entirely silly because we know that it is very possible for folks who have both of those diseases to be able to engage in sex in smart and helpful ways, right? And can live really fulfilling sex lives that never pass on that illness to anyone else, right? We can be really intentional and smart about those things. And the stigma is still there, right? People have visceral reactions to people disclosing that they have these types of diseases. We make lots of jokes about it, right? Maybe it's foot herpes, right? Or making jokes about people having HIV or people having the clap or whatever, And it's unfortunate because there are real people who have these illnesses and are receiving the brunt of this stigma for absolutely no reason besides we've just decided that like this is how we're going to do it. And because it is a false narrative, right? Like it's absolutely not true, the things that we learn about STDs, right? Like I remember being in high school and the ways that my health teacher tried to get us to not have sex with each other is to show us pictures of genital warts, right? Like it was supposed to be like disgusting and awful, right? And like the culture around that type of stigma around sex and the diseases that may come from sex is like deeply ingrained, and it's really deeply problematic in a lot of different ways. So this is our encouragement for all of us to really dig deep into some of the reactions or patterns that we have around our understanding of STIs and to challenge the narrative that we've been taught that is really tied to systems of misogyny, systems of sex negativity, right? Like all of the isms that are terrible and that we are always trying to fight against. Is that enough of a, like a big lecture?
God, it was a beautiful rant. I'm so glad you shared the thing about the health class.
Yeah,
the
right?
health teacher being like, it just makes me so sad how we're built to hate our bodies.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely.
Meanwhile, like our bodies are inherently like susceptible to disease and infections and pus and bumps. And do you know what I mean? Like,
absolutely.
Do you remember when I shared on a Patreon like 2 years ago? I talked about going to the gynecologist and them like doing a pap smear and then telling me that, after my appointment, I might have some like discharge, like extra discharge, because they basically like scrambled it up in there. They like made it. They loosened some stuff, right? And I came home and I had this whole epiphany that like, especially being somebody with a vulva, like I had grown up with so much shame about like discharge and like stuff that comes out of your body and my period and stuff like that. And I had this epiphany in my fucking late 30s. Like, what do I think? It's like a clean waiting room in there. Like our bodies are naturally produce stuff, like I don't know what I thought it was inside my body. You know what I mean? Anyway, that's just a brief aside to dispel the shame.
My understanding is that it's a flower in there, and that anytime you have sex, it crumples the flower until no one wants it. Is that not what it's like?
No, my garden has been hoed. You know what I mean? Like there's no flowers left.
just
anyway,
earth in there.
It's just mud. It's just straight mud and worms. So anyway, so yeah, Sam is totally right. I love what you wrote in your letter about the work that you're doing to dispel this inner shame and the societal stigmas. But we also know here at Just Break Up that we can do all of that work internally and we still have to combat it externally. And that is unfortunately something that we have to bear in this really shame, stigma-centered society. But yeah, so I'm going to, before we talk about actual words that you can say in this conversation, I just want to present a couple ideas that will hopefully relieve you of some stress and maybe give you some tools of comfort if this conversation goes in a way that you don't think that you don't want it to go. The first thing I want to say, I don't know this person, this man, and you're right. He could just be an emotionally immature D-bag. Like that could be the end of that. And also, sometimes when we're getting to know somebody, like I know that I have in the past, I've been guilty of like relying on well-worn paths in my conversation. Do you know what I mean? And we're all constantly learning how to be better with our language and our intentions. And like, maybe he's not a douchebag is what I'm trying to say with that stupid joke that he made.
Yeah.
We're collecting all this data to infer who we think this person is, which is a form of like trying to protect ourselves. We're preparing ourselves for who this person is, how we can respond to them, whatnot. So it makes sense to me that you like really, especially with your experience, you clung to this comment because it was immature and it directly related to your one of your biggest fears about yourself. You know, the point I'm trying to make is that you go into this conversation with an open heart about his response. Give him a chance to react differently in a different context, because it will hopefully bring out a different side of him. And maybe he will learn not to make those dumb jokes anymore because we're not in middle school, you know? I'm not making any like bets on this person. I just don't know them well enough to be like, oh, he's going to react differently, or he's going to react in a way that I want him to react. But you've, based on your letter, you know, it sounds like you've already ascribed such guilt and doom. This conversation is doomed, that he's not going to respond well because of this comment. That's what I want to say. And I don't think that's necessarily true. Basically, I like to remind myself to give people an opportunity to show their compassion and to show their empathetic side, and also their emotional maturity. When people show us who they are, both in, you know, immature comments or in how they respond to our vulnerability, you know, general reminder for everyone that other people's emotional maturity might feel like a parameter for ours, but it's not. Like, we don't have to act by their rules. So if he responds differently than you want him to, if he responds poorly, you don't have to communicate with his tools. You don't have to internalize his stigma and his shame and his immaturity. You can just say that person is walking around the world with different tools than I have. My tools are sharper, they're shinier, they're more loving, they're more compassionate, and they don't match his tools. You know what I mean? You don't have to use his immaturity or his lack of compassion as a reflection of yourself. Yep.
And I think, you know, it's really possible, like Sierra said, that he might respond in a really immature way. I also want to create space for the idea that he might respond in a mature way and still be hurt by what happened, right? Like, yeah. And still be like,
yep, perfect.
I don't appreciate that you didn't tell me this the first time we hooked up or any of the other subsequent times that we hooked up. Why are you waiting a year to tell me this? Which I think is like a legitimate hurt, right? And I think you also know that it's a legitimate hurt, right? Like, the fact that you didn't disclose this is something that's going to impact him, right? In a way that you know, that you didn't necessarily consider when you didn't tell him about this. And of course, you have all of these different reasons why, and all of those reasons are really understandable. Like Sierra said, like, I get it. Absolutely. Like, I could imagine being in the exact same situation and making the exact same decision, right? Because like, who is this guy? I don't know him. And also, he just made that weird joke. Like, why would I tell him about this? Like, all of those different things. And especially if you were in a place where you weren't transmissible, right? Like, also totally get that, right? Like, if there's not any chance that you're going to pass it on, then like, yeah, I get it. But all of that it being true, you also fucked up. And I appreciate that you are naming that for yourself, right? Like, because you can have all of these reasons and understandable reasons why, and admit that it was like not the best thing to do, right? And that you would have done something different with different information available to you. And I think owning that for yourself and sitting in the idea, like we said, what we were talking about before, right? Like, sitting in the idea of like, I messed up and it's okay that I messed up because I'm a human and it doesn't mean that I'm not deserving of love. And so if he comes back to you and says like, I'm actually really hurt by this, I want to figure this out with you, or I want to talk about this, or I want to share it with you, right? Sitting in that reminder for yourself of like, yes, I had all of these different reasons that are understandable. I'm a human that made a choice that in retrospect was not the right choice to make. And it doesn't mean that I'm a terrible person. Doesn't mean that this man is somehow going to, like hold this over me for forever, right? Like that can help you enter this conversation in a more empathetic spot for how he's going to react and respond to what you're sharing. Because if you can have empathy for yourself and say like, yep, I'm a human who messes up and I messed up in this, it becomes easier if he says, I'm really hurt by this, to be like, I can understand why. Absolutely. And you deserve to feel hurt. Like it's understandable that you feel hurt by this. Like I messed up, so that we're not doing that back and forth of like, well, here's all the reasons why I did this thing. And like, it's not as bad as you think it is. And instead being like, yeah, it's pretty bad. And I'm sorry for that. And I have reasons why I did it, but that doesn't mean that I should have done it. Right. That makes it easier to move towards accountability, which I think will be helpful in this conversation. So that's my advice to you is to hold that for yourself and offer yourself that forgiveness. Sierra and I forgive you. We get it, right? Like, absolutely. And yeah, we understand it, right? And I think having that forgiveness for yourself will make it easier for you to go into that conversation without, it'll still be nerve-wracking. Like, don't get me wrong. I can understand also why you're terrified of having this conversation and how he's going to react. And like Sierra said, if he reacts poorly, great. Like, more about him now and you can get yourself out of that. You don't have to respond with those tools. But if he responds in a way of saying that he's hurt by this, acknowledging that, yeah, you did wrong can help you see that hurt and try to tend to that hurt with more care and compassion than if you're feeling defensive about it.
Yeah. And the one piece of advice I have in terms of what to say, I think you know what to say intuitively, just based on what Sam just said too, being ready to receive his emotions as well as compassion for yourself. The one thing I would add is twofold. Like, I want you to explain to him how what you've done, like what you two did, like together sexually, has been safe, and why people assume it's not. And also, in tandem with that, acknowledge why it doesn't, you totally understand why it wasn't safe in the realm of trust and intimacy. And that's what we're talking about here too. You know what I mean? Like, there's this stigma about having sex with STIs and STDs that needs to be dispelled. But there's this other layer that I do think like complicates that stigma, or like makes it even heavier, of intimacy, vulnerability, trust, and honesty, which sounds like you are used to employing in other parts of your life. It makes sense that, how about this? The reason why I want you to acknowledge both of those things is because if you only acknowledge one, like if you only say this is why it was safe, then you're not actually acknowledging the emotional, like that wouldn't tend to any wound that I had. I would say, I don't care. You didn't blah, 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 so just acknowledging that that the emotional safety, the safety of transparency and partnership was not, was not offered in the way that he thinks.
For sure. Absolutely. It's always hard to have a conversation after we've made a mistake, right? And it is always hard to own that. And it's always hard when we're anticipating what somebody is going to say to us and how they're going to react to us. And I want to just say that I really appreciate the care that you're using in how you are going to approach this conversation. I really appreciate that you're owning the accountability around the idea that you made a mistake for lots of different reasons. And I want to say that, having these types of conversations, even if this one doesn't go well, is the type of practice that I think Sierra and I and our community talk about on the show, right? This vulnerability, this being willing to own things that we've done wrong, this willingness to hear and see people in the pain that we might have caused them, is practice that will be helpful for you as you move through the rest of this journey with relationships with people, whether it's with this person or with someone else. So we're both here to say, like, this is tough. Like, it is, we are sitting over here, like, giving you all this advice, but we know that, like, in the trenches of this, it is really, really difficult to do. And all of the fear and anxiety that goes with it is really real. And
yes,
I want to say that, like, I'm so glad that you are choosing to do this vulnerable thing and have this conversation, admit that you messed up, and invite a different way of being in relationship with each other.
Absolutely. Sam and I love you so much. We love you as you are right now with all of the choices that you made. And we especially love the person you're trying to be. We believe in you, and we hope this helps.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for writing. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. If you would like more content from us, or if you would like ad-free episodes, you can always support us on Patreon. If you support us on Patreon for as little as $5 a month, you'll get an additional bonus weekly episode where Sierra talks about her pap smears. So I don't know if that's like an incentive for you or not, but check it out. Patreon.com/justbreakuppod.
You can slide into our DMs, send us your favorite relationship memes, but most importantly, you can submit your questions about all matters of the heart at justbreakuppod.com, which is the only place that we receive your questions. And that's also where we have all of our awesome Just Break Up merchandise.
Please remember to like, follow, subscribe, give us a 5-star rating and review. This literally keeps our mics on and helps us reach more brokenhearted souls who need two random strangers giving them relationship advice.
Just Break Up is a production of Duvid Media, original music, recording, editing, producing, all magical things by our good friend Spencer Worth Davis. Make sure to check out his podcast. And remember, mistakes are our teachers. We can accept the lessons they offer to us without letting go of the compassion we have for ourselves. Every day and in every way, we can slide into that better version of ourselves. And tomorrow, our actions can match our intentions. And if all else fails,
just break up.